Snake handling is not anywhere near the mainstream religious practice in the mountains of Appalachia. In fact, snake handling is illegal in all the states that make up Appalachia except for one, West Virginia. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia. Before we get rolling with this, be sure to go down below, click that subscribe button if you would, ding the bell so you get notified every time we have a new episode out, and give us a thumbs up too.
You're not planning on bringing any snakes out in this video, are you?
What do you care? You're in Wise. I'm in Kingsport, so.
I know, but hey, but I'm just asking, do you want a back door? Because I'll be glad to accommodate you with a back door here if you're going to bring snakes out in this. But seriously, this is, it's funny, but it's also kind of sad too at the same time with this kind of story that, snake handling has been, I don't know, for a long time. It was such a driven thing in the mountains of Appalachia. But, like you said, there's only one state in the entire union that still allows this. And that's, I'm saying it with a smile, wild, wonderful West Virginia.
But they believe in religious freedom up there.
That's right.
That is absolutely true. And we talked about that before in our earlier episode about that one preacher whose wife was killed during a service. That's not what we're talking about today. We're going to tell you a little bit more about the how it came to be through one particular Southwest Virginia preacher. Okay? Well, the doctrine behind snake handling, as well as poison drinking, yes, folks, that's also a religious practice akin to laying hands on deadly serpents, as found in the Bible, in the books of Mark and Luke. Mark chapter 16, verses 7 and 18, Jesus, resurrected and prior to ascending to heaven, appeared to his disciples and promised them that believers shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. Now, those words really meant something to a preacher born and raised in Scott County, Virginia, who decided to take those Bible passages quite literally. George Went Hensley was born on May 2nd, 1881, to a large family in Scott County in far southwestern Virginia. His family tended to move around quite a bit, living in Hawkins and Loudoun counties in Tennessee, and then in Big Stone Gap, Virginia. And it was while living in Big Stone Gap that Hensley claimed to have seen his first snake handling at a revival at a coal camp where an elderly woman picked up a snake without harm during a service.
Well, George Hensley, like many Appalachians of the time, was reared a Baptist, but left the church in 1901 and married the first of his three wives, Amanda Winninger. Now, the couple moved to, I hope I get this right, Steve, Ooltewah? I think I said that right. Ooltewah.
Yes, you did.
In southeast Tennessee, where Hensley went to work in an ore mine and took up the traditional Appalachian practice of, not snake handling, moonshining, folks. Okay, he attended a Holiness Pentecostal Church of God service and was swept in the religious fervor associated with that faith, experiencing a conversion. After that, he became a traveling preacher of the Pentecostal faith, which was experiencing a boom in that area and at that time as a part of an awakening in the United States. By 1909, Reverend Hensley was with the Church of God in a place called Grasshopper, Tennessee, near Chattanooga. It was about that time that Hensley became fixated on those verses in Mark that Steve kind of conveyed early on in the podcast or in our video about taking up serpents and drinking poisons, and began to preach that those verses should be taken literally. His explanation in a 1947 newspaper interview was that he had seen a snake while walking up a hill, knelt in prayer, took a hold of the snake, and he brought it to church, instructing the congregation to prove their salvation by holding the snake. And folks, that's exactly what they did.
Good for them. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
Well, Preacher Hensley argued from the pulpit that if you were a true believer and had the Holy Ghost inside you, then you'd be able to take up any venomous snake, be it a rattlesnake, a copperhead, a viper, or any other deadly snake, and be protected from harm. Oh, you could chug quite a bit of poison, too, and be perfectly safe. Now, the practice spread along with Hensley's travels throughout Appalachia, preaching and became quite a popular practice in the mountains for a time. Now, the Church of God not only tolerated Hensley's unorthodox teachings, but defended it well, at least for a little bit of time. By 1922, though, it and other mainstream Protestant churches discouraged their members from the practice of handling venomous snakes and drinking poison, eventually disavowing the practice. Now, as Rod kind of hinted when we started this video, he had the first of 3 wives, and as you can probably guess, Preacher Hensley himself was not a paragon of value and virtue. He was married 4 times, divorced 3, and it said that he liked the taste of the bottle, which meant he was frequently drunk. Even with those faults, though, his snake handling followers saw him as a great man and often dismissed his shortcomings as fabrications. Now, Hensley had been on a tour preaching and returned home to find Amanda having an affair with a neighbor. Now, Rod, the good preacher, promptly attacked the neighbor with a knife and then fled to the hills to hide from the law. While there, he turned his back on his unique faith and he built a still, which was the line of business he was in before he was saved. Eventually, George Hensley was captured and brought to justice, not for knifing the neighbor, but for the moonshining. He was put to work on a chain gang. He escaped that fate, though, and headed to Cleveland, Ohio, and resumed preaching and picking up snakes for the Lord. And while in Ohio, he met and married his second wife, Irene Klunzinger, with whom he had 5 children, in addition to the 8 that he had with Amanda. 8. 8 and 5 makes what, Rod? 13.
13.
Right?
Yeah. Whoa. Well, that's a nice start on a little congregation right there, I guess, isn't it, Steve?
It is.
Well, none of this stopped Preacher Hensley, though, and in 1932, he and Irene moved to Pineville, Kentucky to preach at the Pineville Church of God, which Hensley established himself. The moves continued, though, a sort of a wanderlust, if you want to call it that, and the Hensley family ended up then in, of all places, Pennington Gap, Virginia, where Irene gave birth to a second child in July of 1935, and in St. Charles, with George conducting snake handling services. Well, one of his more well-known services at this time was held in Norton, Virginia, with about 500 people in attendance for the event. Things went smoothly until a boy in the audience killed one of the snakes that had gotten just a bit too close for comfort for him. Well, do you blame him? Throwing the whole service into an uproar. I'm sure it did, didn't it, Steve?
I can imagine that little boy saying, "Oh no, God gave me a brain to get rid of this snake." So yeah.
Where do you want a back door in this tent right here? Okay, I'm going to give you one. All right.
Well, with all the moving around, Hensley decided to build a house on the back of a trailer truck, an early motorhome, if you will, and began driving it to Florida to hold services. Back in Pineville, Kentucky, he was arrested for handling snakes and moved to Knoxville, Tennessee in 1939. And experiencing marital troubles yet again, Hensley separated from his second wife and eventually moved to Ottawa, where he and one of his followers, and a preacher in his own right, Raymond Hayes, started their own church, the Dolly Pond Church of God with Signs following. This church eventually became the mother church of Southern snake handling religion.
Well, George Hensley married for a third time, this time to Inez Hutchinson, but sadly, that marriage only lasted less than a year before she left him too. Well, I don't know. She just left him. I don't know the reason why, but he ended up marrying for a fourth and final time in 1951 to Sally Norman of Chattanooga. Well, state authorities in Appalachia began to become very concerned about these practices and promptly began to ban the practice of snake handling, beginning after World War II with the state of Tennessee, which was responding to the bad publicity stirred up by the death of a Dolly Pond church member from a snake bite. Other states quickly joined Tennessee in banning the practice, and with the notable exception of West Virginia. You see, West Virginia Constitution expressly forbids any law that impedes upon, or promotes any religious practice, which has been interpreted to mean that the state can't outlaw snake handling as a religious practice. Now, the ACLU's even gotten involved in the legal issues in banning the practice on the side of the various churches, with the result that nowadays most laws regulating snake handling focus on the trauma caused to the snake being handled and not the danger to the congregation from an angry, aroused, venomous serpent. It's been argued that the poor conditions in which the snakes were kept, such as overcrowding, insufficient food and water, led to poor health for them and less of a tendency to be able to strike out at someone handling them, as well as producing weaker venom.
Well, in the little over 100 years that the practice of snake handling has been in existence, 71 people have died from being bitten during church services, including our very own George Went Hensley. You see, in July of 1955, Preacher Hensley began a series of services near Alta, Florida. In a Sunday service on the afternoon of July 24th, several dozen people were gathered at an old blacksmith shop to hear Hensley preach. At that service, the preacher reached into an old lard can, pulled out a 5-foot-long snake. Now, we don't know what kind it was, other than it was poisonous. He wrapped that snake around his neck and began rubbing its head on his face. So far, so good. Well, while continuing to preach, Hensley removed the snake and was in the process of putting it back in the lard can when the snake apparently decided that, no, it wasn't going to be put back in there, and promptly bit the good pastor on the wrist. After a few minutes, Hensley became ill, in great pain, and had a badly discolored arm where he was bitten. The county sheriff's office was called out, and they, along with the congregants, begged him to seek medical assistance, but he refused and blamed his suffering on the congregation's lack of faith in the Lord. Not his, but the congregation. Hensley died the next morning, with the coroner ruling the death suicide by snake.
Suicide by snake. Wow. Well, here's another one for you, Steve. This got me too. Why did he, in the first place, why did he start rubbing on this snake, taking this snake and rubbing on his face? Maybe the snake didn't want to go back in the can, but maybe the snake enjoyed what George Went Hensley was doing to it at the time. And maybe it was like, well, maybe I like that. I don't know. I'm just being facetious about the whole thing, but this is wild. I mean, just to hear a little bit of the story about where some of this came from. Wow, I'm telling you, this is something else.
Well, when you think about religion in Appalachia, a lot of people outside the area think this is what every church down here does, and it's not.
Yeah.
It's a very minority practice, illegal everywhere but West Virginia, although it still goes on up in the hollers just as quietly as they can. They still handle those snakes. And it's, I guess, just a little bit of the part of this tradition here in Appalachia.
I saw something on TV one night of where someone in Kentucky, in southeast Kentucky, was collecting these snakes. And then they were going and taking them. And I don't know if they were doing it, covertly, sneaky. I don't know how they were doing it. But they had it looked like almost a resort, a spa in this little building that was built above a garage. And they were taking care of these snakes. And finally, I think the game warden finally came in and told the guy, says, you can't do this. And he was there and he was like, but, I've got people for churches. Said, that's just too bad. They're going to have to get them from somewhere else. But you can't do this and collect these snakes when they're supposed to be out there in the wild and then give them to somebody else, up a holler somewhere, or take them over to West Virginia, because I think they said something along the line of that was almost like a trafficking violation, almost in a way of taking, an animal across state lines and taking it over, even though it's recognized in West Virginia, it was still illegal.
Well, folks, that's the story of George Went Hensley, first snake handling preacher in Appalachia. Another story in the history of our area. Thanks for listening. Now, you can subscribe to the Stories Podcast at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or on your favorite podcast app. And you can subscribe to it here on YouTube by clicking the subscribe button and dinging that bell. So, till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.